Welcome to Lady Mythos. Tonight I want to introduce you to a goddess you're certain you already know. You've seen her 1,000 times without even trying. A cat. Elegant, composed, paws folded, sitting like she quietly owns whatever room she's in. Soft. Safe. The kind of face people put on candles and tote bags and phone cases. But the very first people who ever knelt to her were not picturing a pet. Not even close. They were picturing a lioness in mid-hunt. Powerful, silent, and utterly without mercy. A creature who once helped the sun god himself try to wipe the entire human race off the face of the earth. That's the contradiction I genuinely can't let go of, and it's why I wanted to make this one. How does a killer become a kitten? How does the most terrifying thing in the desert end up dozing on a warm windowsill, purring at the afternoon? And here's the detail that really gets under my skin. The Egyptians didn't simply adore this goddess. They adored her so completely that one day, on one battlefield, that adoration may have cost them an entire kingdom. They would not raise a hand against one of her cats, not even to save their own people from an invading army. So this is the question I want you to carry with you the whole way through, because I promise it pays off by the end. How did a war-lioness who nearly ended the world become a house cat curled at the foot of the bed? And what did all that overwhelming love secretly cost? If you like myths told the way a friend would tell them, slow, strange, and a little darker than you expected, go ahead and hit subscribe so the next one finds you. And do something for me while you get comfortable. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and whether there's a cat in the room with you right now. Because some of you, by the time we're done, are going to look at that little animal very differently. Chapter 1. The Lioness Before the Cat. Picture the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, somewhere close to 5,000 years ago. The yearly flood has come and gone, and it's left behind a shallow, glassy lake sitting low in the land. Reeds leaning in the breeze, heat shimmer rising off the surface, waterbirds bursting up at the smallest sound. And down at the waterline, half swallowed by the gold light of early morning, a lioness, utterly still, watching. Every muscle in her body folded up tight and waiting for the one moment that matters. That image, that precise image, is where Bastet begins. Long before she was anything gentle, she was that. The people who lived around these wetlands watched lionesses hunt, and they did the thing humans have always done with whatever frightens and astonishes them at the same time. They knelt. They named it. They turned that predator into a god. And they called her Bast. And I need you to feel how old she is, because almost every retelling sprints right past it. We can trace Bastet back to at least 2800 BC, to the Second Dynasty, near the very dawn of Egyptian civilization. Her name, her image, sitting on burial goods from an age when the pyramids hadn't even been imagined yet. Let that land for a second. By the time the Great Pyramid was new and gleaming, Bastet was already old. She watched that whole world get built. Here's a detail that tells you exactly how important she was, and you rarely hear it. At the Valley Temple of Khafra at Giza, raised around 2570 BC, only 2 deities had their names carved into that sacred stone. 2. Out of a pantheon absolutely crowded with gods. One was Hathor, the other was Bastet. She wasn't some minor good luck charm scratched onto a pot. She stood in the front row, shoulder to shoulder, with the greatest powers Egypt had. Now, her name, because it's stranger than it looks. You'll usually hear Bastet translated as she of the ointment jar. It sounds almost tender, doesn't it? A goddess of perfumes, of sweet oils, of healing salves. And she did carry that. People came to her for protection wrapped in ointment, for remedies, for a shield against sickness and the unseen things that creep in at night. But keep that softness in one hand, because in the other you must keep the lioness. Some scholars think the ointment jar meaning is really a pun, a sound-alike, and that her name truly ties back to her sacred city instead. Both readings have survived, and both are true in the only way that really matters. The healing balm and the hunting claw belong to the same goddess, packed tight into a single name. She mends and she maims, and the Egyptians never saw any reason to choose between the two. Because in these earliest days, Bastet is not a comfort object. She is a daughter of Ra, the sun god himself, and that bloodline does not come with a soft job. It comes with the worst job in all of creation. Think about what a lioness meant to these people. Not a symbol on a wall, a real animal at the edge of the dark, capable of killing a grown man, moving without a sound. To make that your goddess is to admit something honest about the world, that the force which protects you is the very same force that could destroy you, depending entirely on which way it's facing tonight. The Egyptians didn't flinch from that. They built their whole idea of her on it. So when you imagine early Bastet, throw out the cushion and the candle. Picture the lion-headed woman standing over still water at dawn. Gold light running along her shoulders, perfectly calm, right up until the instant she isn't. That is what they prayed to. That is what they trusted to guard them. The gentle cat that everyone pictures today was, at the very beginning, the last thing on earth you'd ever want to meet in the dark. And the sun god was about to put that ferocity to use by handing her an assignment so terrible it nearly unmade the human race. Chapter 2. Bastet and the Eye of Ra. To understand what Bastet truly was, you have to meet a piece of Egyptian belief that hardly ever gets explained properly. The Eye of Ra. Because the sun god did not only possess a sun, he possessed a weapon. A living, burning piece of himself that he could tear loose and send out into the world to punish anyone who dared defy him. And that weapon, that detached fury, took the shape of a goddess. A raging, lioness-headed goddess. Sometimes that goddess is named Sekhmet, sometimes Hathor, and sometimes Bastet. This is one of those places where the myths simply refuse to line up neatly, and I'd rather say so plainly than quietly smooth it over. These goddesses bleed into one another. They trade roles, share the same fire, wear the same fury from one story to the next. Bastet is one face of something far older and far bigger than any single name. She is, at her core, the rage of the sun made flesh and given a body that hunts. And there's one story about that rage that I find genuinely chilling, in the best possible way. The texts tell of a time when humankind grew proud and began to plot against Ra, the very god who made them. So Ra did what a furious god does. He reached up, tore loose his eye, and sent the lioness down among them. What follows is not a clean, measured punishment. It is devastation. The goddess sweeps across the land, and she does not stop. And here is the part that tips the whole thing into nightmare. The punishment stops being about justice at all. Something in her refuses to be satisfied. She simply will not stop. And Ra, watching from above, realizes with horror that he is about to lose the entire human race to the very weapon he unleashed. His protector has become his apocalypse. The thing he built to save his order is now turning against everything inside it. So how do you switch off a god who has gone too far to listen? You can't overpower her. She is power. You have to outwit her. And the trick the gods land on is one of the most vivid, unsettling images in all of mythology. They take a colossal amount of beer and they dye it red. Blood red. And through the night, they flood an entire field with it. When dawn comes, the lioness descends, sees what she believes is a vast, shining lake of blood, and she drinks and drinks until the fury slowly drains out of her and her limbs grow heavy and a thick calm settles over her, and the killing finally, mercifully, stops. That is the hinge the whole goddess turns on. The rage is never destroyed. It's pacified, soothed, coaxed into sleep. And the goddess who walks away from that red field at dawn is softer than the one who arrived at dusk. Not because she was beaten, but because she was eased. Hold that tightly, because it is the exact blueprint for everything Bastet is about to become. And that rampage, the red lake and the goddess at the very heart of it, is really the story of Sekhmet, the burning lioness of that massacre. I've given her the full telling she deserves in another video, and if you want to see that terrible night from her side, there's a card in the corner you can tap once we're done here. There's an even older idea threaded through this. The Egyptians spoke of a goddess who wanders off, far to the south, into the deserts of Nubia, and has to be lured and charmed all the way home before the land can be whole again. The dangerous one, gone over the horizon, needing to be welcomed back gently. Over and over, the same shape. The fierce feminine power that must be calmed, courted, brought back into the house. That story is older than the cat. The cat is simply where it finally comes to rest. I'll be straight with you. The first time I really sat with this, I stopped thinking of Bastet as the cat goddess entirely. Because if this is the raw material, a force that nearly drowned the world in blood and had to be tricked into stopping, then the real mystery isn't why she's fierce. The real mystery is how on earth a whole civilization ever felt safe enough to bring that home and let it sleep at the foot of the bed. Chapter 3. How Egypt's war goddess became a house cat. The answer to that question has surprisingly little to do with the gods and almost everything to do with grain, with mice, with the very ordinary, very human business of trying to keep your food and your children alive through the night. Somewhere across the long, slow centuries, Egyptians began keeping cats. Not worshipping them, living alongside them. And a cat, it turns out, is a small daily miracle in a house built of mud brick and stacked with stored grain. It kills the mice that would eat your winter. It kills the snakes that could kill your baby while it sleeps. It does all of this quietly, ruthlessly, and asks for almost nothing back. The Egyptians watched this little predator guard the home the same way a lioness guards her cubs. And something clicked into place. So Bastet shifted, slowly, across a span of time so vast, it's genuinely hard to hold in your mind. Roughly, after 1100 BC, her lioness face begins giving way to the face of a domestic cat. And I want to be honest about the contradiction, instead of tidying it up. She does not have one single true form. For ages, she is a lioness. Then, gradually, artists and storytellers reimagine her as a cat. Both are real. You are watching a goddess evolve in slow motion, century by century, as the people who love her change around her. But here's what I find quietly beautiful about it. They did not throw the ferocity away. They re-aimed it. The same fury that nearly ended the world got turned and pointed at the things that threaten a family. Bastet became the guardian of the home, of women, of mothers in the terrifying danger of childbirth, of children breathing softly in the dark. The lioness never died. She simply started standing watch over the cradle instead of the battlefield. Same eyes, same readiness, new target. You can read it in how they drew her. A woman with a cat's head, holding a sistrum. A sacred rattle that made music for the gods. Sometimes, that little ointment jar resting in her hand. And often, gathered at her feet, a cluster of kittens. The killer, ringed by new life. That isn't decoration. That's a whole civilization telling you, in a single picture, exactly how it needed to feel about her. Protected, not threatened. And she wasn't only a guardian. She was a goddess of pleasure, of perfume, of music, of the good, warm parts of being alive. Joy itself fell under her care, which is a strange and lovely thing to sit beside the bloodshed of the Eye of Ra, the same divine name covering both the slaughter and the song. There's one ritual that captures this double nature better than anything else, and it's wonderfully eerie. If a person feared the fierce side, the plague-bringing, fever-burning side, the Sekhmet in her, there was a spell to calm her down, to turn the lioness back into the gentle cat. You would walk slowly around your own house at night, carrying a club carved from a special wood, reciting words meant to push the fury away from your door. And buried inside that spell is a line that still raises the hair on my arms. I am the son of Bastet. I will not die on account of you. Imagine whispering that in the dark, circling your home, bargaining with a goddess to please, tonight, be the kind one. Because that was the bargain Egypt struck with her. She would be soft, as long as you never, ever forgot that she didn't have to be. The pharaohs understood this perfectly. One old teaching tells the king himself to be like her. He is Bastet, who protects the two lands, it says. And in the same breath, he is Sekhmet against the one who transgresses. Protector and punisher in a single sentence, the way she always was. And once this goddess belonged to every household in the land. Once her name was whispered over cradles from one end of Egypt to the other. Her own earthly city was about to rise into something staggering. Not just a holy place, the beating heart of an empire. Chapter 4. Bubastis, the City of Cats. Her home on earth was a city the Egyptians called Bast, which means, quite simply, the House of Bastet. The Greeks knew it as Bubastis. Today, it's a tumble of ruins called Tel Basta. But in its prime, it was one of the most important cities in the entire country, and the foreign travellers who saw its temple could barely find the words to describe it. One of them left us a picture of it that I think about often. He described the temple of Bastet as sitting almost on an island, ringed by wide canals drawn off the Nile, lined with tall trees, so that as you came toward it, the sacred house of the goddess seemed to float in a moat of green water at the very center of the city. The streets had been raised up around it over the years, so that you looked down into the temple from above, and there it was below you, gleaming, framed in water and leaves. It was built to stop you in your tracks. By every account, it did exactly that. And this is where Bastet's story stops being only about faith and becomes about raw, worldly power. Because for a long stretch of Egyptian history, her city wasn't merely holy, it was royal. During the 22nd dynasty, a line of pharaohs ruled all of Egypt from this region. Kings so bound to the place that historians literally call them the Bubastis dynasty. Sit with that. The cat goddess's hometown became the seat of the crown. The same city where ordinary families left tiny cat figurines as humble little prayers was now where the ruler of all Egypt sat enthroned. Her family grew along with her city, and the family tree is gloriously tangled. She was given a son, Mythos, a lion god, fierce in exactly the way Bastet used to be. Almost as if her old ferocity had been spun off and given its own name and its own teeth. There's a tender image too, of the pharaoh Taharqa, shown as a small child being nursed by a lion-headed Bastet. The warrior goddess as a nursing mother, cradling the life of the king himself, protector and parent at once. Then there's a thread almost nobody hears, one of those quieter, older traditions. Before the famous stories hardened into place, some Egyptians linked Bastet to the birth of Anubis. Yes, that Anubis, the jackal-headed lord of the dead, the one who weighs your heart. Later versions of the myths would tie Anubis to other goddesses instead, and the sources openly disagree. But for a time, the gentle cat of the hearth was also bound up with the god who waits at the very threshold of death. She was never, ever, only one thing. And if that thread pulls at you, the cat goddess tangled up with the jackal lord of the dead, I've followed Anubis down his own dark path in another story on the channel. There's a card for him too, for whenever you're ready. And here's a contradiction the Egyptians didn't seem to mind at all, though it twists a modern brain. Bastet is the daughter of Ra. But as the Eye of Ra, she is also called his companion, his consort, daughter and partner at the same time. To us, that sounds impossible. To them, it made perfect sense, because the eye isn't really a separate person. It's a part of the sun god that goes out, acts, and returns. Of course, she is both born from him and bound to him. She is him, walking around with her own face. So her city was magnificent, her bloodline royal, her myths deep and strange. But none of that is what made Bubastis famous across the whole ancient world. What made it legendary happened just once a year, and it was so loud, so completely uncorked, that a foreign historian who stood and watched it could scarcely believe his own eyes. Chapter 5. Inside Ancient Egypt's Wildest Festival. The Greek historian Herodotus travelled through Egypt and wrote down what he witnessed at the festival of Bastet. And when you read his account, you realise this was not a hushed, incense and whispers sort of holy day. This was, by a wide margin, the biggest party in the ancient world. He claims that something like 700,000 people made their way to Bubastis for it. 700,000. And remember the scale of that world. This is an age when a respectable town held a few thousand souls. A crowd like that was almost beyond imagining. They came by river, packed shoulder to shoulder onto barges, drifting down the Nile in their countless thousands, and the sound of them must have rolled across the water for miles before you ever saw a sail. And the behaviour on those boats, Herodotus does not hold back, and I love him for it. There was music everywhere, castanets and clappers, the rattle of the sistrum, flutes and drums, and singing skating across the surface of the river. There was dancing. And as the barges slid past the towns along the bank, the women aboard would lean out and call to the locals, jeering, taunting, shrieking with laughter, and some would stand right up and lift their skirts toward the shore in a wild, deliberate gesture of mockery. It was raucous. It was rude. It was joyful in a way that feels almost startling coming from an ancient temple rite. Then there was the wine. Herodotus says that more wine was poured at this single festival than in all the rest of the year combined. There's a name people use for what this was: sacred drunkenness. Getting drunk here wasn't a slip or a sin against the goddess, it was the worship itself. To dissolve into music and wine and noise and laughter. To lose yourself completely for one night. That was how you honoured her. And I think that one detail cracks open a side of Bastet the cute cat version completely misses. She was never only the silent guardian of the quiet hearth. She was the goddess of pleasure, of release, of taking the lid off and letting the pressure out. The very same goddess who watched over a sleeping infant also presided over the single most abandoned night of the entire year. Protection and ecstasy, held in the same hands. The Greeks felt the power of her so strongly that they reached for their own pantheon and matched her with Artemis, their fierce huntress, protector of women and the young. They didn't just observe her festival, they threw themselves into it like nothing else they'd found in all of Egypt. To a Greek, this was a goddess they recognized in their bones. So picture it just once more before we turn. A glittering flotilla of barges strung out along the Nile. Torchlight and music and skirts and wine. A city swollen to hundreds of thousands of bodies, all of them drunk on devotion. For a cat. It sounds like nothing but delight, but a love this enormous always carries a blade somewhere inside it. And on the wrong day, in the wrong moment, getting it even slightly wrong could cost a person their life. Chapter 6. Why killing a cat meant death. Here is where the devotion stops being charming and turns frightening. In Egypt, the cat was not merely well-liked, it was sacred, a living animal of the goddess herself. And both the law and the crowd treated harming one as something close to murder. The Greek writer Diodorus Siculus put it about as bluntly as it can be put. Whoever killed a cat in Egypt was condemned to death, and it made no difference whatsoever whether you did it deliberately or entirely by accident. Intent simply did not enter into it. A dead cat meant a dead person. Sit with how absolute that is for a moment. There was no, "It was a terrible mistake." There was no plea. There was no defense that would save you. And Diodorus did not merely hear this secondhand. He says he watched it happen with his own eyes. During his time in Egypt, a Roman, a citizen of the single most powerful empire on the planet, the kind of man you genuinely did not lay a hand on, accidentally killed a cat. The crowd gathered fast, and here's the part that turns my stomach a little. Egyptian officials, fully aware of the catastrophe of a murdered Roman and the war it might bring, actually tried to step in and save the man. It changed nothing. The crowd's devotion was simply stronger than their fear of Rome. They turned on him regardless. Think hard about what that reveals. Their reverence for Bastet's animal was so total that it overrode politics. It overrode self-preservation. It overrode the very real dread of provoking an empire that could wipe their city off the map. A foreigner's life, weighed against a single cat, came out as nothing. And the love ran just as deep on the gentle domestic side. When a treasured household cat died, it wasn't simply buried and forgotten. It was carried away to be carefully embalmed and laid to rest, wrapped and preserved the way a person would be, a member of the family given a proper passage into the next world. People grieved their cats, and then they prepared them for eternity, the same way they did for the humans they loved. I'll admit, this is the part where the gap between them and us feels widest. We love our pets too, fiercely. But we don't turn on strangers over them. To the Egyptians, though, none of this was fanaticism. It was simply, obviously true, that the cat carried a spark of the divine, and to harm one was to wound something holy. So picture that street one more time. A man frozen over a small, still body. An official with his hand raised, pleading for calm. And a crowd that has already made up its mind. Now hold that exact feeling and widen the lens, because a question follows it around like a shadow. If a single dead cat could doom a man in a city street, then what in the world would happen if a clever enemy discovered that Egyptians felt that way and decided to use it? Chapter 7. The Battle. Egypt lost because of cats. The year is 525 BC. The Persian king, Cambyses II, has come to swallow Egypt whole, and the two armies meet at a place called Pelusium, guarding the eastern gateway into the country. On one side, the forces of the pharaoh, Psamtik III. On the other, the vast and disciplined Persian war machine. And what is supposed to happen next is a straightforward, brutal clash of empires. But there is a story about this battle, and I have to be honest with you about where it comes from before I tell it, because that honesty is the entire point of this channel. This account does not come from an eyewitness. It comes from a Greek writer named Polyaenus, who set it down centuries after the dust had settled. So I want you to treat it as a legend that grew up around a very real defeat, not as a verified battlefield report. Tell it around the fire, not in a courtroom. But oh, as a fireside story, it is unforgettable. Polyaenus says that Cambyses knew precisely how the Egyptians felt about their sacred animals, and that he turned that devotion into a weapon. According to the tale, the Persians painted the image of cats onto the face of their shields. And worse, far stranger, they drove living animals out ahead of their advancing line. Cats, dogs, ibises, the very creatures the Egyptians held most holy, herded forward across the open ground like a living, breathing wall in front of the soldiers. And the Egyptian archers, the story goes, froze. Picture one of them, bow drawn, arrow nocked, the enemy closing the distance, his home and his family at his back. And there, on the shield rushing toward him, the painted face of Bastet's own animal. A real cat darting in terror across the dirt between the lines. To loose that arrow was to risk killing the goddess's creature. to stain his own soul, to commit the one unforgivable thing. So the tale says they couldn't. They wouldn't. The hands that should have defended Egypt simply would not move. And Pelusium fell. Egypt fell. Brought down, if you believe the story, not by a sharper blade or a better plan, but by the sheer, bottomless depth of their own devotion. The aftermath was real enough, whatever you make of the cats. Psamtik's reign collapsed almost as soon as it had begun, and Egypt, ancient, proud, 3,000 years deep, was folded into the Persian Empire as just another province. A civilization that had watched the pyramids rise now took its orders from a foreign throne. And if the tale holds even a grain of truth, it's a chillingly modern kind of warfare, dressed up in cats and bronze and dust. Cambyses didn't outmuscle the Egyptians. He found the single thing they could not bring themselves to do, and then he built his entire attack around it. He turned their own faith into the gap in their armor. And whether or not it unfolded exactly the way war-lioness claims, the legend has survived for a reason. It captures something everyone in the ancient world already believed about Egypt: that these were people who would genuinely rather lose than harm a cat. That is a devotion so pure, it curdled into a weakness an enemy could hold like a knife. And that is the bitter irony I cannot shake loose. They would not lift a hand against a single cat to save their own country. And yet, at that very same moment in history, behind the high walls of the temples, that exact same love was quietly killing cats. Not by the dozen, not by the 100, by the million. Chapter 8. The Dark Secret of the Cat Mummies. This is the part of the story almost nobody tells, and it's the part I think you most need to hear. Because the great love affair between Egypt and its cats had an underside, an industrial, assembly line underside, and it is genuinely, deeply dark. Cast your mind back to that festival. Those pilgrims pouring into Bubastis by the hundreds of thousands. They did not arrive empty-handed. A pilgrim wanted to leave an offering for the goddess, something physical, to carry their prayer up to her. And the offering they wanted, more than anything, was a mummified cat. A small, wrapped, sacred bundle you could purchase, dedicate, and leave behind in her house. Now multiply that single act by those enormous crowds, year after year, century after century. The demand for mummified cats became something almost beyond comprehension. So the temples met that demand the way any supplier meets a demand. They manufactured it. And the scientists who have studied these mummies have uncovered something genuinely chilling. Enormous numbers of these cats were bred for one purpose only: to be raised as offerings and never allowed to grow old. Many of them were barely more than kittens. Studies of their remains show that great numbers were deliberately cut short, long before any natural end. These were not beloved pets who died peacefully and were lovingly preserved out of grief. They were a product, born to be sold, born for the altar, and nothing else. And the scale of it is staggering. Vast cat cemeteries were carved out across Egypt, at Bubastis itself, at Saqqara, at a place called Beni Hassan. Catacombs crammed with the wrapped bodies of cats, stacked in the dark, sometimes hundreds of thousands of them in a single site. Picture walking one of those tunnels by torchlight. Shelf upon shelf of small linen bundles, neat and silent, running back further than your little flame can reach. An entire underworld built of devotion and small, silent, linen-wrapped bodies. Then comes the final twist, and this one is recent enough to feel like a slap across 3,000 years. In 1888, a farmer near Beni Hassan broke open the ground and found a cat cemetery so colossal the estimates run past 200,000 animals. And here is what the modern world chose to do with them. They were dug up, shipped across the sea to England by the literal ton, and ground into fertilizer. Sacred offerings to a goddess. 3 millennia of prayers wrapped in linen, scattered across English farmland to help the crops come up. One account even claims the auctioneer selling off the haul used a cat's skull as his gavel, wrapping it to take bids. I genuinely don't know whether to laugh or to feel sick. There's an old Egyptian tale that fits this dark turn almost too well, and it's worth knowing. A proud, arrogant prince named Setna becomes obsessed with a beautiful woman called Tabubu, the daughter of a priest of Bastet. Step by patient step, she leads him on, until he has signed away all of his wealth to her, and then, in his desperation, agreed to the deaths of his own children. And the instant he reaches for her, she lets out a scream and dissolves like smoke, leaving him with nothing, stripped bare and humiliated. Tabubu was Bastet herself, wearing a mask, punishing his arrogance. It's a warning the Egyptians never let themselves forget, even if we have. The gentle cat of the hearth always, always kept her claws. So I'm going to put the question to you directly, because I've been turning it over in my hands this entire time. What do we do with a goddess who was, at one and the same moment, the fierce protector of cats, and the very reason that so unbelievably many of them died? Epilogue. What Bastet still means today. And that carries us all the way back to the lioness at the water's edge. Back to the dawn, the leaning reeds, the still gold lake, and the predator watching, unmoving, from the shallows. Because the answer to everything we followed tonight was hiding in that very first image, the whole time. The lioness never left. That is the real secret of Bastet. We told ourselves such a tidy story. The killer became a kitten. The war goddess settled down. The fury got tamed into a purr. But it was never tamed. Not once. It was only ever soothed, exactly like that night of red beer poured out across a darkened field. Gentleness and ferocity were never two different goddesses standing side by side. They were always only the same one, turning to show whichever face the moment asked for. The cat on the warm windowsill and the lioness wading through the slaughter are the same set of eyes, blinking slowly at you across 5,000 years. And once you truly see that, the contradiction we opened with quietly dissolves. The love that made Egyptians cradle their cats and refuse to harm them, and the love that bred and slaughtered cats by the million to feed a hungry goddess, those were never opposites. They were the same devotion, the same fierce, total, slightly frightening love, simply aimed in two directions at once. That, I think, is the genuinely uncomfortable thing Bastet has to teach us. The instinct that tenderly protects and the instinct that ruthlessly consumes can live inside the very same heart. Often, they're the same instinct, wearing two faces. And you can still feel her if you look. Watch how we treat cats now. Pampered, photographed, crowned the unquestioned royalty of the entire internet, adored in a way that would make perfect, easy sense to a pilgrim drifting down the Nile to Bubastis. We never actually stopped worshipping her. We just changed the temple and traded the barge on the Nile for a screen in our hands. Every time a cat curls up in a sunbeam and a million people stop to look, a very old goddess stretches and opens one eye. And she was never alone in what she stands for either. She belongs to a whole family of goddesses across the world who carry that same shape, the raging power that has to be soothed into mercy. The Greeks felt it the instant they met her and simply called her Artemis. The pattern is older and wider than Egypt itself. It's something we human beings keep reaching for over and over. The desperate hope that the most dangerous force in the world might choose, just for tonight, to be the gentle one. There's a reason her story sits a little uneasily, and I think it's worth naming out loud. We like our myths to come with a clean moral. The hero, the monster, the tidy lesson at the end. Bastet flatly refuses to give us one. She's living proof that the ancient world didn't slice the universe into good and evil the way we're so fond of doing. To them, the thing that blessed your home and the thing that could end your life were simply the same sacred power. And the task of being alive was learning to live close to it without flinching. There's something almost forbidden about that idea now. And maybe it's also the most truthful picture of love anyone has ever drawn. So here is where I'll leave you. The next time a cat looks at you, really looks, with that flat, ancient, faintly unimpressed stare, I want you to remember what you're actually looking at. Not a pet, a descendant of the thing that guarded the cradle and very nearly ended the world. The gentle one and the killer, sharing a single face, deciding, moment to moment, which of the two you get to meet. If this story pulled you under the way it pulls me under every time, do me a small kindness and let me know it landed. Like the video so it finds the next person who needs a story tonight. Leave me a comment telling me whether you'll ever look at your own cat the same way again. And subscribe, so you're right here when I dig up the next one. I read every single one of these, and they mean far more than you know. Until then, thank you for listening. Yours, Lady Mythos.